Good evening everyone, welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy, the Hindu News Analysis. Today is 4th July 2025 and today we have some very important topics for the discussion. And in fact, the PDF of this class will be available in the description section and you can download the PDF. So however, we have a few important topics from different newspapers. So one by one, we'll try to discuss all these important topics in a very detailed and in-depth manner. So without any further delay, let's get into the discussion. And the first topic that we need to discuss is about the critical minerals supply chain that the Quad has been planned to create to counter Chinese dominance in the critical minerals. And in our past lectures, we have discussed about the critical minerals several times. And for India also, critical minerals are very important. However, here the problem is China has been dominating the critical minerals. And because of this particular reason, very often these countries are also facing the supply chain disruption with respect to the critical minerals. So therefore, the Quad has decided to create a critical minerals supply chain, right? So we all knew that the second Quad foreign ministers meeting has been taken place in Washington DC. During this particular Quad meeting of foreign ministers, all the members have committed to 4 key areas or affirm the commitment to 4 different areas. So they include maritime security and transnational security, economic prosperity and security, critical and emerging technologies, and humanitarian assistance. So these are the 4 areas that the four Quad countries have reaffirmed their commitment, right? And in fact, we all knew what are those 4 Quad countries: India, Australia, Japan and US, right? So these are the 4 countries. They have some objectives in the Indo-Pacific region. And in fact, the foreign ministers, they have strongly condemned the Pahalgam terror attack. And in fact, they have urged the perpetrators and organizers and even the financiers of this particular terrorist attack and other terrorist attacks be brought to justice promptly, right? So another important aspect of this foreign ministers meeting of Quad is that they have joined hands for a critical minerals chain. And in fact, India, Australia, Japan and US, so they have jointly launched Quad Critical Minerals Initiative, right? So all these 4 Quad countries have launched Critical Minerals Initiative, and the objective of this Critical Minerals Initiative is to build a resilient and a much more diversified supply chains. And we all knew that recently China even stopped exporting these critical minerals, some critical minerals, to India as well. Indian industry and the Indian government has raised concerns about China imposing certain curbs on export of these critical minerals because they are going to affect Indian industries. And because of that reason, it is important and significant that these Quad countries need to ensure the supply chain resilience. And because of this particular reason, so they have launched a critical minerals initiative, and it will help build resilience and also diversified supply chains for minerals which are vital to the modern technologies. And in fact, this initiative will further enhance cooperation on securing and even diversifying the supply chains of our countries. However, recovering critical minerals from e-waste and boosting private sector investment to strengthen the supply chain resilience as well, right? Because Quad essentially fundamentally talks about the cooperation and collaboration among all these 4 countries, right? So they also aimed at securing and also diversifying the supply chains and even recovering the critical minerals from the e-waste and further giving a boost to private sector investment to strengthen the supply chain resilience. However, Quad members, they have expressed some serious concerns about growing dependency on China, because the growing dependency on China So China uses this for its advantage for processing and even refining the critical minerals, and warning of risks like economic coercion, price manipulation, and even supply chain disruptions that India has recently experienced this. Now, if I talk about the quadrilateral security dialogue, which is Quad. So, what is Quad? So, a Quad is a quadrilateral security dialogue, right? So, this is not a formal alliance. Quad is not a formal alliance. Rather, it is an informal strategic forum, and that comprises four maritime democracies. And in fact, these four maritime democracies are India, Japan, Australia, and United States, right? So therefore, this is important initiative because it would protect all these four Quad countries, and it also ensures the supply chain resilience in terms of critical minerals for the Quad countries, right? So they have concerns regarding a growing dependency on China for processing and the refining of these critical minerals, and these countries no longer dependent on China. And in fact, these Quad countries also warned of economic coercion by China, a price manipulation by China, and supply chain disruptions by China. Now, in fact, if you can look at a Chinese dominance in critical minerals, you can see here China dominated the supply chain, right? So with respect to critical minerals production and processing, so China heavily dominated all the critical minerals. For example, so if you look at the natural graphite, right? So China is like 100% production of natural graphite. Manganese, China near about 90%, and 85% for rare earth elements. And for cobalt, it would be around 65. So therefore, China heavily dominated the critical minerals production. However, if we talk about the critical minerals, so they include the rare earth elements as well. And in fact, like 75 to 80% of all rare earth elements are produced and processed in China itself. And in fact, these rare earth elements are also very important and essential for other advanced technologies such as semiconductors manufacturing, electric vehicles manufacturing, and even jet fighters manufacturing. So however, China actually dominates the production of neodymium iron boron magnets. So these neodymium iron boron magnets, so they are vital and important for the electric vehicle motors and power steering and braking and more. So I would say for an automobile industry, so this neodymium iron boron magnets are very essential. However, here the problem is China dominates the production of this particular element. So therefore, if China imposes any curbs on the export of this particular element, then automobile industries will certainly face a lot of problems in all these Quad countries in general and India in particular. However, so it is being said that these rare earth elements are available all across the world, but China leads in efficient processing of these rare earth metals, and that actually makes the difference. And in fact, this position, so it was once held by countries like US and Japan, right? So in fact, Japan has also revived part of its mineral processing industry through the policy measures, while the US and India, they remain largely dependent on Chinese exports, right? So in fact, Japan has been doing good in terms of minerals processing through a number of policy measures, but India and US, it is still concerning that they are largely dependent on Chinese exports, and China can use this for their geopolitical advantages or geopolitical benefits. right? So US and India, they remain largely dependent on Chinese exports. So next important topic is healthy aging for Indian population. So we'll be understanding what exactly is a healthy aging and what is the need for a healthy aging and what needs to be done for ensuring healthy aging for Indian elderly population. The context is that recently Indian Institute of Science Bangalore has launched Bharat Study, and this Bharat Study has been launched to establish India specific biomarkers for healthy aging. So this essentially for India specific biomarkers for the healthy aging, and it even aims to bridge the gaps in diagnostics which are caused by Western centric health data. So as of now, so the data which is Indian oriented is not available, so therefore it aims to bridge the existing gaps in diagnostics which are primarily caused by the Western centric health data. Now what is healthy aging concept? So we need to understand this concept of healthy aging. Now healthy aging actually refers to maintaining physical, mental and functional well-being in older age populations, right? So this is actually a healthy aging. Now in India, so we have a huge demographic dividend, and this demographic dividend will over a period of time would result in increasing old age populations. So therefore it emphasizes on the need for a healthy aging, which is physical, mental and functional well-being in old age populations. And this emphasizes on quality of life, not just longer life, right? So higher life expectancy is good, but along with the higher life expectancy, we should also have the quality of life for our elderly, so free from other illness, free from the comorbidities, and which is in a very simple terms called as healthy aging, which is physical, mental and functional well-being in older age populations. And it also emphasizes on quality of life, not just longer life. And in fact, the biological age of elderly population often differs from the chronological age. Now if I say biological age, so which is something that indicates the age of the organs, how healthy the organs are, how healthy an individual is, so which is a biological age, and that differs from the chronological age. And in fact, aging is also a continuous process because it is being marked by molecular and cellular changes like telomere shortening, and in fact factors like early life infections, pollution and social support. So all these factors shape how one ages, right? So in fact, if I can mention an example for this, a 60-year-old may have an organ health of 75-year-old, right? So that's the difference between the biological age and the chronological age. And if you look at the data and statistics of aging in India, now rising elderly population, now it is being said that by 2050 around 20% of Indian population, that would be around 319 million Indian people, will be 60 plus years of age. And in fact, if you look at the disease burden on the elderly population, so Parkinson's disease, which mostly affects the elderly people, in India it is projected to rise by 168% and dementia by 200%. So this affects the quality of life of our elderly people. So therefore the disease burden will also increase, and we need to focus on healthy aging. We need to focus on quality of life of elderly people. However, increasing elder dependency ratio burdens the healthcare system, and it will increase more pressure on the pensions. And in fact, National Sample Survey Office, so 75th round actually shows only 28% of elderly have any formal pension access. So in this context, it is very important that we need to focus on healthy aging, right? So we need to focus on a healthy biological age of our elderly people. Now, what are the essential features of a healthy aging? Now, if you carefully look at the features of healthy aging, So those people who are going through the healthy aging, so they actually maintain the activities of daily living like cooking, walking and bathing very freely and very actively. And in fact, so even if those elderly population, so if they are going through the healthy aging, they will recover very quickly from illnesses and the psychological stresses like surgeries as well. And in fact, there will be no depression, no social isolation, and even the cognitive decline will not be observed among the elderly population who are going through healthy aging. And in fact, we need to use indicators like CRP and HDL and even metabolite levels to detect the subclinical aging. And in fact, so those population groups who are going through the healthy aging, so they are culturally and even biologically adapted parameters. And if you can look into it, the male population and the female population, so this is the bulge, and this bulge has been indicating that we have a huge demographic dividend, and over a period of time this demographic dividend will result in increasing elderly population. So therefore there is a need for a healthy aging in a country like India. We need to emphasize on the biological age rather than the chronological age, so that it will reduce the burden on the existing healthcare system. However, there are certain challenges in ensuring healthy aging. Now, what are the challenges in ensuring healthy aging? Now, in all major topics, we have been emphasizing on lack of data or data scarcity. For example, so we don't have India specific longitudinal data or biomarkers and aging. So this is the main problem that we have been facing when it comes to healthy aging. If we have data, it will result in evidence-based and data-driven policy making in India, and that is the need of the hour. Secondly, there is a huge cultural resistance which is existing as well, because elders often distrust hospitals and AI-based tools for early screening. And this cultural resistance also a roadblock or a hurdle for ensuring healthy aging in India. And apart from that, there are some financial constraints as well, because the geriatric healthcare gets a low budget priority from the government. Very often, government is not spending adequate amount of money in geriatric healthcare. And in fact, in India, total healthcare spending is less than 3% of the overall GDP. So therefore, there is a need to overcome these financial constraints, and there is a need for significant allocation from the government for this geriatric healthcare. And there is a sampling bias which is existing as well, because collecting data from the healthy elders is very difficult due to the already existing illness. So if the illness is already existing, it will be very difficult for collecting data. And in fact, the Bharat study also flagged a challenge of finding non-comorbid samples from the elderly population in India. And apart from that, the early life infections, malnutrition, so they also affect the aging trajectories in Indian elderly population. So one such example would be the high childhood undernutrition. So it leads to early onset of diabetes in adults. So if any child who is facing the undernutrition, and it will lead to early onset of diabetes in adults. So therefore, the early life infections and malnutrition, so they also affect the aging trajectories as well. However, what needs to be done? So we need to vaccinate and campaign for pneumonia-free older Indians, and organized health camps in rural areas, and healthcare providing free health services to 21-year-old age homes in Delhi, NCR and other areas, and educate less privileged children in government schools. And apart from that, organize healthy awareness talks among the elderly population. So these are some ways we can ensure healthy aging in India. And apart from that, data is also very important, and creating awareness, education and communication with the elders is also very important to overcome the problem of cultural resistance. right? So I hope you have understood this topic. And the next important topic is, can Supreme Court halt an act passed by a state? And in India, so the state legislative assemblies and even parliament have the right to pass laws. Parliament passes laws on subjects in the union list and concurrent list, and states also passes laws in the subjects in the state list as well as the concurrent list as per the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution. Now in this context, the Supreme Court can halt an act passed by a state. So we'll be understanding about this. So what happens is that a Supreme Court recently held that passing an act by state of Chhattisgarh, so subsequent to its orders, because in 2011 Supreme Court passed an order, and subsequent to that particular order, Chhattisgarh State Legislative Assembly passed an act, and Supreme Court recently held that so such a legislation or such an order so cannot be said to be an act of contempt of the order passed by the court, because when Supreme Court passed an order in the year 2011, and subsequent to that Chhattisgarh State Legislative Assembly passed a law, and somebody filed a contempt petition in the Supreme Court, and in response to that contempt petition, the Supreme Court has responded that this particular legislation passed by the Chhattisgarh State Legislative Assembly cannot be said to be an act of contempt of the order passed by the court. However, the Supreme Court of India, so it has recently concluded a writ and contempt petition. So it has concluded the writ petition as well as the contempt petition in a landmark case called Nandini Sundar and others versus State of Chhattisgarh. And in fact, the court has clearly clarified that passing of a new state law, so even when related to a matter which is previously ruled upon, so it cannot be equated with the contempt unless it contradicts the constitutional norms, unless it is clearly violates the constitutional provisions, so it cannot be said as a contempt. So therefore, a Supreme Court has been very clear on this matter, right? So it has clarified that passing of a new state law, so even which is related to a matter which is previously ruled upon, so it cannot be equated with the contempt. However, because this particular legislation is not violating the constitutional provisions, right? So the judgment also highlights the boundaries of judicial review, right? Because there is a separation of judiciary and legislature and executive, which is called as separation of powers, and this particular judgment of the Supreme Court highlights there existing certain constraints or the certain restrictions within the judicial review, certain boundaries of judicial review in legislative affairs. So therefore, it ultimately reaffirms the doctrine of separation of powers. The legislature have certain powers, executive and judiciary, so they have the certain powers and they act within those powers given to these bodies by the constitution. However, the background to the case is in July 2011, Supreme Court has actually issued a significant order prohibiting the use of special police officers by Chhattisgarh government for anti-Maoist operations. And in fact, the court even ruled that recruiting inadequately trained or ill-trained and poorly paid the special police officers for counter-insurgency is violative of Article 14 and even violative of Article 21 of the Constitution. And this is what the Supreme Court has said in 2011 July. Because the Article 14 and Article 21 of the Indian Constitution safeguard the right to equality and also right to life, respectively. So therefore, the Supreme Court even directed the withdrawal of all arms which are being given to the special police officers, and the Supreme Court even ordered the union government to cease funding for their recruitment. And the recent legislative response by the Chhattisgarh State Legislative Assembly. So subsequent to the Supreme Court's 2011 order, The Chhattisgarh government enacted Chhattisgarh Auxiliary Armed Forces Act of 2011. And this law has authorized the creation of auxiliary force to support regular security forces in controlling insurgencies, with specific provisions to address the court's earlier concerns. And in fact, there are two important sections in Chhattisgarh Auxiliary Armed Forces Act of 2011. They need a mention here. Section 4 clause 1, so it has authorized the auxiliary forces for non-frontline assistance. Secondly, section 5 subclass 2 of the Chhattisgarh Auxiliary Armed Forces Act of 2011 ensured such personnel would not be deployed in direct combat. And apart from that, a mandatory training of 6 months and strict eligibility screening were also introduced as part of this legislation. And this legislation move was challenged as being violation of the 2011 judgment of the Supreme Court, so thereby leading to the contempt petition on this legislation. And if we talk about the contempt of court, Article 129 and Article 215 talks about the contempt of court. So it specifically talks about the powers of the Supreme Court and High Court as a court of records that includes power to punish for contempt of itself. And also remember, not just Supreme Court but also High Court under Article 215 considered as the court of record. And Article 142 clause 2, it actually enables the Supreme Court to investigate and also punish any person for its contempt as well. So these are two important provisions for contempt of court. So I hope you have understood this topic, and even if you have any doubts regarding this particular discussion, so you can comment those doubts in the comment section and we'll be ready to address all your doubts. And thank you so much.